Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our third class on this project on visual thinking and education. So, as you remember, we're doing the first module, which is about the implication between philosophy and visual thinking. And today we are going to talk about thinking with images, metaphors, and myths. So, we're going to try to see even more striking and more profound connections between philosophy and visual thinking by analyzing two philosophers who talked about first myth and second metaphors. And we're going to try to see how these two stylistic tools, the tool of myths and the tool of metaphors, can have many resemblance with visual thinking, but also some differences. So let me start with the first author that we are going to analyze today, which is Plato. We're going to analyze Plato first because he really delved deep into the concept of myths. And he actually used many myths in his dialogues in order to explain his philosophy to a broad and general audience. So, who was Plato? Plato is certainly one of the most important thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, certainly more important than Socrates. And that's because Plato wrote something, so we have something written by him, and we can actually read his philosophy, but at the same time, because his ideas were a little bit more complex and sophisticated than Socrates' idea. Plato lived in Athens between the 5th and the 4th century BC, and as you remember, he was one of the many students of Socrates, probably the best student that Socrates had. After Socrates' death, which was an event that profoundly impacted Plato's life, he decided to found the Academy, which was a philosophical school where people of all ages, people that were at least above 18, however, could just go there and learn about philosophy. They could learn everything that revolved around this very fascinating word. And I wanted to tell you this information because actually the academy, Plato's Academy, was one of the earliest institution of what we now call higher education, that is university. So it's sort of like funny to know the history of how universities developed throughout history. But during his lessons in the academy and throughout his written works, Plato covered every aspect of philosophy, from politics to ethics, from metaphysics to cosmology, from education to art. So you see here that philosophy was a very broad and general category for Plato. And as you know, Plato's philosophy was expressed mainly through dialogues that were meant for a general audience, where Plato chose very interesting and fascinating characters that had to debate fundamental questions about justice, virtue, courage, love, the nature of reality, and so on and so forth. But the most important point is that rather than presenting his most important philosophical ideas in only one form, that is, in a systematic form, in the form of a systematic treaty, what Plato did was trying to frame this idea as a conversation that invited the reader to empathize, to identify themselves, and at the same time to think alongside the participants of the dialogue that he was writing. And so, unlike many texts, unlike many modern philosophical texts or works that only rely on strict argumentation and logical precision, Plato's works actually blurred the line between philosophy and literature, between reason and imagination. And so they actually blended together logical argumentation, logical precision, technical definitions with a dramatic type of storytelling. Among, of course, the various type of techniques that Plato used for creating these dramatic storytellings, the most important was the use of myths. Myths, which were narratives that could go beyond the limit of our rational knowledge, of our rational understanding, in order to grasp something important about the human condition, about the soul, about the afterlife, about the nature of the cosmos, and so on and so forth. So myths, according to Plato, they were not merely an ornament to the philosophical discourse, they were a powerful vehicle for grasping and developing philosophical insights, offering a visual imaginary of what reason could not grasp by itself in rational terms. Okay, before I move on with the explanation of what myths are for Plato and how he used myths throughout his dialogues, let me pause for a second and let me tell you two information about the meaning that myths had in Greek society and how they were used in the Greek society. So the word mythos, which is the Greek word, simply means a story or tale. So it does not have the modern connotation of a falsehood that the English word and also other words like the Italian words carries with it. For many Athenians, indeed, myths were traditional narratives that carried the weight of collective memory and cultural identity. At the same time, the myths were stories that narrated the origin and the birth of the cosmos, the mysterious origins of the cosmos, that narrated all of the temperaments and actions of the gods, of the Olympian gods, and at the same time they narrated the foundation of the social and political institutions that governed human life during that time. So you can see here that myths actually permeated every aspect of human life and civic existence at that time, involving the religion dimension, but also and even the educational dimension, so that we can say that from childhood onward, Athenians absorbed a worldview that was framed by these narratives, by these myths. I also want to point that from the beginning, myths had a very pedagogical function, had a very important pedagogical function, because yes, they described heroic deeds, they described the influence of the gods in the human world, but at the same time, they conveyed moral lessons, they conveyed warnings, and they also articulated models of virtue and of hubris, which is a Greek word that means arrogance. So they conveyed these models in order to shape both the private conduct of Athenians and of the people of the Greek city-state in general, but also the public conduct of these people. Central to this tradition of using myths in this way is certainly Hesiod on the one hand and Homer on the other hand. Very briefly, Hesiod wrote the Theogony, which is a poetic genealogy that recounts the births of the gods and the origin of the universe by tracing the succession of rulers starting from primordial chaos until the reign of Zeus. What Hesiod was trying to do is to create to create the history of a cosmic hierarchy where power, justice, and authority were born at the dawn of time. So the point was to demonstrate how all these concepts that are so important that were so important, for the societies in Greece, all these concepts were born at the dawn of time. That is, they were born with the origin of the cosmos itself. On the other hand, Homer's Iliad portrayed the gods' active involvement in human affairs, such as their influence during and over the Trojan War. Thus illuminating here the interplay between fate, between divine favors, and moral choices, or mortal choices, because there's like this double dimension. In the Iliad, we see gods intervening in battles, swaying heroes' actions, and embodying different aspects of human nature, so that the complexity and the anthropomorphism of divine will is brought to the fore. But both Homer and Hesiod, through their myths, they help to create a framework for understanding life uncertainties, for understanding the influence of divine powers over the human world, and for understanding how humans were supposed to act. So this framework depicted a world that was governed by fate, as I told you before, divine favor, divine powers, and at the same time personal responsibility. Now, Plato. What about Plato? What does Plato say about myths? We already know that for him, myths are not simply an ornament to a philosophical discourse, but actually, we can say many more things about myths in the Platonic world. The first thing that I want to say is that for Plato, Plato was a little bit critical with the traditional use of myths and traditional tales that Athens, in this case, inherited from Homer and Hesiod. Because for him, at least, there was a risk within how these myths presented the gods. Indeed, the gods, which were the most perfect beings, were presented as acting deceitfully, as acting violently, as acting immorally. And so it was unworthy, according to Plato, to present the gods in this way. Indeed, as I told you, they were the most perfect beings. And how is it possible that perfect beings, divine beings, are acting so immorally, and at the same time are feeling this negative emotions such as jealousy, for instance, and overcoming someone else's and imposing his power, or their power, on somebody else. So for Plato, it was a deceitful representation of who the gods were, and so he didn't like it. And the main problem was that by presenting the gods in this way, the risk was of corrupting the moral imagination of the citizens of Athens. And by corrupting their moral imagination, the risk was, in particular, the risk was that of corrupting the youth. And we know how important the youth were in the Athenian society. So Plato really criticized the traditional use of myth and the traditional tales that Greece inherited from Hesiod and Homer. But at the same time, although he criticized it, he did not dismiss myths altogether, simply saying that they were dangerous and useless. Instead, he recognized the enduring power of myths to move the soul, to communicate truths that reason might struggle to express, and at the same time to shape ethical characters. And so to teach virtues, to teach a virtue comportment, a virtue, a behavior to the citizens of Athens. So we see here that rather than abandoning myth altogether, what Plato does is to reshape myths so as to allow them to serve the purposes of philosophy itself. In his dialogues, therefore, he uses myths as a tool for pointing beyond the limit of logical argumentation and for allowing people to grasp very abstract and complex idea, offering vivid images of the soul, the afterlife, the structure of the cosmos, and so on and so forth, as I told you. Needless to say, of course, all the stories, the myths that Plato narrates throughout his dialogues should not be taken as literary narratives, as literal accounts. They should be taken as philosophical narratives, namely as narratives that were designed to lead the mind toward abstract reflection, moral responsibility, and the pursuit of truth. So you can see, to summarize, how myths, which is a way of narrating through images, by creating very memorable characters and by depicting dramatic scenarios, through the use of myths, Plato was able to transform, through this use of myths, he was able to transform myths from a mere cultural inheritance to a tool, an instrument for teaching, inquiring, discovering truths that were fundamental to philosophy itself. Okay, this is what Plato said generally about myths, but what we want to say right now is that myths had multiple and complementary functions according to Plato. So it is true that myths, generally speaking, are not an ornament to the philosophical discourse, but they represent a fundamental instrument for philosophy itself. But it's also true that they fulfilled different and complementary functions. Which are these different functions? That's the question that we should ask ourselves, and that I am going to answer. Okay, so the first function that it's worth mentioning is the explanatory or illustrative function. That is, myths help to bridge the gap between abstract reasoning and human imagination by illustrating abstract ideas. Indeed, by bringing together philosophical insight and a narrative form, what myths do is to enable to translate abstract concepts and complex ideas into vivid images that can be grasped more intuitively by the audience that was reading or listening to the Platonic dialogues. Instead of demanding the audience to follow maybe a very complicated chains of logical argumentation, syllogism, definitions, and technical distinctions, myths translated all of these technicalities, all of these ideas into something that was more memorable, more concrete, something that was more emotional. And they translated all of this into images that, of course, were more concrete, more memorable, they were more enticing, and, of course, more dramatic. And so they would spark emotions into the audience, thus creating a deeper identification between the audience and the participants or the protagonists of the dialogue. Moreover, we must say that it is true that logical arguments have a very specific kind of rigor, and they are very clear. But although myths do not have the same rigor as logical arguments, they have the same clarity, and so they're also able to persuade the audience and the people who are reading the Platonic dialogues in this case. And so whereas rational arguments persuade through rigor and through precision, myths can convince people not by rigor and precision, but by resonance and imaginary, because it can make the invisible visible and the intangible tangible. Now, before I move on to the analysis of one myth, I want to say that for Plato, this illustrative function also works as a pedagogical, also has a pedagogical dimension, sorry, in the sense that by translating into these vivid images, abstract concepts, the myth could capture the attention of the audience, which would otherwise be distracted by the density and the complexity of what was said. It could sustain the interest of the audience throughout lengthy explanation, and at the same time, it could guide the audience toward deeper philosophical insights. So you see here how this illustrative function has also a pedagogical dimension that is attached to it, and it's really important, and you're going to see why in a couple of minutes probably. Okay, so as you know, I always like to make examples in order to better visualize and better understand the concepts that we are talking. And so I want to analyze with you one myth that really that nicely explains this illustrative function of myths in Plato. And the myth that I've chosen is the myth of the charioteer in the Phaedrus. And let me start by reading the summary that I made about this myth. So, in this allegory of the charioteer in the Phaedrus, so the soul is depicted as a charioteer indeed, driving a pair of winged horses through the heavens. The charioteer represents reason and thus the rational part of the soul, tasked with guiding and controlling the two other horses. One horse is noble, disciplined, and obedient, symbolizing the soul's higher impulses, such as wisdom, courage, and the desire for truth. The other horse, however, is wild, stubborn, and unruly, embodying base desires, bodily passions, and impulses that seek earthly pleasures and distractions. The charioteer's challenge here is to control both impulses and thus both horses, maintaining a balance between them and giving them a direction so that the soul may ascend toward the divine realm of forms and attain true knowledge. You see here that Plato has translated two very complex ideas, which were the idea of the nature of the soul. So what's the nature of the soul? And second, the idea that there is a struggle within the soul itself between reason and passion. And so he has translated these two ideas into a vivid and dynamic image that allows him to create a very memorable and concrete story. Certainly, Plato could have came up with a logical argument that it could have described what was going on in the soul, within the soul, and thus it could have described the struggle between reason and passion, between reason and desires. But if he had done so, that would mean that he translated an abstract idea in purely conceptual terms without being able to convey the same ideas in an imaginative scene, in an imaginative scenarios that would spark the audience interest. Instead of doing that, instead of using conceptual term and that instead of describing this conflict in purely conceptual terms, what Plato decided to do was to use a myth so that people could not only understand, but could also visualize, concretely visualize the struggle that was going on in the soul, thus making this philosophical message more concrete, but also more intuitive. How? That's probably the question that we want to ask ourselves. How can this message be more intuitive, and how can it be more concrete for the people? Well, the answer is basically that it creates a connection between the reader who's reading the dialogue and the participants or the protagonists or the characters of the dialogue itself. So it creates this connection. It creates a belonging together, because the reader feels like the struggle that is being described, it is its own struggle. So instead of determining a separation for which people read the dialogue and say, oh, okay, that's the problem of the charioteer, the reader says, okay, that's my problem. The problem of the charioteer is my own problem. And so there is a connection and an identification between the two. The reader can feel the struggle of the charioteer as their own struggle, as its own struggle, being part of its life. And so by doing this, it can realize that self-mastery is not something reserved for sages, but self-mastery is actually a daily practice, an act of steering again and again the two horses that are going all over the places. And you can see here that there is this very important pedagogical dimension that is attached to this illustrative myth that aims at illustrating this too complex idea about the soul and the struggle within the soul. But it shows us that philosophy basically is not a set of doctrines, but it's a mirror that we can hold up, and through this mirror we can evaluate our own choices and sort of like control where we're going with our own life. Okay. That's the first function that myths have, according to Plato. And that's the first example that I wanted to talk to you about. Let's move to the second function that myths have according to Plato. And in this case, we are talking about an allusive function. That is, myths allude, according to Plato, to a deeper and non-rational dimension of experience and of life more generally. So unlike myths that simply illustrate a complex or abstract idea, myths that have this allusive function, they point to a dimension of reality that exceeds the limits of philosophical knowledge or philosophical inquiry, in as much as this dimension that we want to bring to the fore is a dimension that lies at the edge of human understanding. So these myths treat topics like the immortality of the soul, treat topics like the destiny of human beings after death, or the origin of the cosmos, or also the origin of time and eternity. These are all topics that lie at the edge of human understanding. We cannot assert definitive answers or definitive truths about these realities, these topics, because they're sort of like no one has experienced them very basically. Philosophy, by its own nature, seeks to explore the deepest aspects of human knowledge. So that's sort of like the aim of philosophy, to go deeper into human knowledge. But in so doing, of course, it approaches the boundaries of what can be rationally conceived. And when it does so, that is when it reaches these boundaries, then reason can no longer provide clear definitions or a precise explanation. The reason can no longer work as it should work, as it usually works. And at this time, at this moment, myths become necessary. It is precisely at this time that myths show their utility and their beneficial use, because they allow reason to express truths, ideas that otherwise couldn't be expressed, couldn't be grasped and expressed. Okay, so in this sense, myths are not primitive narratives or pre-rational forms of thinking. They are actually very fundamental instruments that allow philosophers, in this case, but allows our human mind to express truths that belong to the unknown, belong to the realm of the unknown. And therefore, myths occupy a very important and unique position within both culture and philosophy, being a very powerful vehicle to, yes, of course, explore the mysteries that lie beyond our understanding. And they allow to do so not by looking for definitive answers, not by looking at final solutions, but by remaining open to the unknown and by maintaining an attitude of reverence towards the limits of our understanding and our knowledge. So by maintaining this attitude of humility, which we have already talked about with Socrates. Okay, as you might expect, I have a myth for you that I would like to analyze together. And in this case, I have chosen the myth of air, which can be found at the end of the Republic. It's the last chapter, the last myth, and it serves as the culminating vision of the explanation that Plato has done about both justice and the nature of the soul. But let me read my summary about the myth of Air, the story of Air. So the tale begins with Air, who was a soldier who falls in battle. Unlike his fallen companions, however, Air does not remain dead. After 12 days, he miraculously returns to life upon his funeral pyre and tells the extraordinary sights he encountered in the realm beyond death. According to Air's account, the souls of the dead are brought before judges who assess their earthly lives. Those who have lived justly ascend to the heavens and are rewarded with 1,000 years of happiness, while those who behaved unjustly descend into the depths below, enduring 1,000 years of suffering for their misdeeds. After this cycle of reward or punishment is complete, the souls are gathered in a great meadow where they prepare to choose their next life. Each soul is then called forward in a set order to select its next existence. The choices are varied and striking. Some souls opt for the lives of animals, others for the lives of tyrants or ordinary men. Yet Plato emphasizes that the responsibility lies entirely with the chooser. The gods are blameless, for each soul freely selects its destiny based on its character and its judgment. Many souls, unreflective and rash soul, make poor decisions, such as deciding to live the life of a tyrant or the life of an oppressive ruler, while wiser ones choose more carefully, often learning from the hardship of their previous incarnations. Thus, for instance, choosing to live the life of ordinary men, or better, of philosophers. Now we see here that Plato weaves together different themes: the theme of justice, the theme of moral responsibility, and the theme of the immortality of the soul, of course, because it goes through a cycle of reincarnation. And Plato uses this very elaborate story of Air in order to convey a vision of what cosmic justice is and how the moral order of the universe is achieved. For Plato, however, it is impossible for our reason to describe and demonstrate the ultimate nature of the afterlife. That is, to describe how the afterlife looks like and and demonstrate why and how it exists. Because the afterlife cannot be the direct object of philosophical knowledge, inasmuch as we cannot have any experience of it. So human reason is limited in this regard. It cannot grasp the afterlife as it is. It cannot grasp the truths, the essential truths about the afterlife, and in particular, it cannot demonstrate the afterlife. It cannot give us definitive truths about the afterlife. But what we can do is to use myths in order to say something, to describe the afterlife, not by claiming definite truths about it, but by giving us an idea of what it is, of what it might be, without the risk, of course, of falling prey of both errors, mistakes, and misinterpretations, which is something that, of course, Plato wants to avoid. So you see here that through the myth of air, Plato tries to approach the topic of the afterlife in an indirect way, not directly, but indirectly, using vivid images and dramatic scenarios to stimulate our understanding of the afterlife, but also our reflection about the afterlife, and also our moral contemplation of the afterlife. Beside this myth also, as much as the myth of the charioteer, has a pedagogical dimension attached to it, because by presenting this afterlife as a structured realm in which souls face consequences for their actions and also make choices for their next lives, this myth encourages us to become aware of the importance of virtue, of justice, and of ethical responsibility. Okay, that's the second function that myth can have. Let's look at the third function, which is, of course, the pedagogical, the educational, and the moral function. This is the last one, but it's definitely not the least important, because according to this function, myths serve as a guide to orient individuals toward the pursuit of the good life and toward virtue. So we're understanding, grasping how to act virtuously. But what I want to say is that without this function, myths would be mere ornament to the philosophical discourse. That is, this is the most important function of all the three that we have named, because it's actually part of each and every single myth. A myth can have an illustrative function, but it also has a pedagogical function. It cannot not have this pedagogical function. A myth can have an alluding function, but it cannot not have this pedagogical function, because it what gives meaning, it is what gives depth to myths. So every single myth has this pedagogical function. Okay, but the point is that by presenting philosophical and ethical lessons in a narrative form, myths engage both the mind and the imagination, but also our own emotions, because they make something abstract more tangible and more visible. That is, they make moral rules, not something abstract, not something that we have to learn and remember, but something that we have to embody within our own life. Thus, through this narrative and emotional power, myths can dramatize the reward of justice and temperance, but at the same time, they expose the dramatic and destructive consequences of arrogance, injustice, and ignorance, for instance. Okay, so you see here that the point is not simply to present moral rules that should be followed as dogmas also. Now, the point is not to say, okay, you need to be virtuous, you need to be courageous. Now, that's not the point. The point is to help people to see how important these rules are, and at the same time identifying themselves with the protagonist of the story so as to embody these moral rules in their own life. As you might expect, I have another myth. This is the last one that we're going to analyze together. And this is probably the most famous myth that Plato has ever written. And I'm talking here about the allegory of the cave, which is found also in the Republic. Since this is a pretty long myth, let me just read it to you. Read, of course, the summary that I have prepared, and then we're going to briefly analyze it, because actually this is a very rich myth, and we could spend 5 classes just talking about this one singular myth. But In this allegory of the cave, Plato asks us to imagine a group of prisoners who have been confined in a subterranean cave since childhood. Bound by chains, they are forced to face a wall, unable to turn their heads or see something else directly. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners runs a raised walkway, along where people pass carrying various objects, stages, and figures of animals. These objects cast shadows on the wall before the prisoners, and the prisoners only know these shadows, and so they take these shadows to be the whole of reality. Let's suppose that one prisoner is suddenly released, and when he does so, his experience is a first one of shock and pain. Turning toward the fire, he is dazzled and confused, unable to comprehend the reality of the object that are casting the shadows on the wall. If then he is compelled to leave the cave and ascend into the real world, the world above, his suffering deepens because the bright sunlight blinds him and he is overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sights of the natural world. Yet, as his eyes slowly adjust, he begins to perceive reflections in water. Then he begins to perceive things themselves, like trees, animals, plants, people, and so on, until finally he can look upon the sun itself. In this final vision, he recognizes the sun as the source of light, life, and truth, understanding that the sun governs all that he now sees, just as fire governed what he could see in the cave, the shadowy illusion of the cave. If this enlightened prisoner returns to the cave, however, he encounters hostility. His eyes, now accustomed to the light of the upper world, struggle to see in the darkness, and other prisoners might mock him for his blindness. If he attempts to free them and lead them upward, then they would resist violently, even threatening to kill him, preferring the familiar shadows to the painful journey toward truth. So that's the summary that I've prepared of the allegory of the cave. And you can see here, you can clearly see from what I told you that this myth symbolizes first the human condition, second, the transformative power of education. And so you can really beautifully see how this myth has a pedagogical and moral function. It encompasses these two functions within it. But let me talk about these two topics of describing the human condition and describing the transformative power of education and philosophy, of course. Okay, first, the human condition. Now, this myth describes the human condition as one of ignorance. That is, Plato tells us that most of human beings live in ignorance, mistaking appearances for reality, not being able to grasp what is really the reality, but just stopping themselves at appearances. Now, Plato, however, by telling the stories, does not convey to us the message that that is a dogma. Most people confuse appearances with reality. He's not just claiming this truth or this idea or this opinion. What he does instead, he creates a very vivid image and dramatic scenario that forces us to imagine ourselves in the cave. So the point for us is not just to learn and then memorize a philosophical truth. Most people live in ignorance. Ignorance is part of the human condition, but it's actually to identify ourselves and to imagine ourselves as being one of the prisoners of the cave, so that we can better understand what it means to live in ignorance, what it means that the human condition is one of ignorance. That's the first point. The second point is the transformative power of education. This is clear, okay? Plato is representing here philosophy and education and culture as a process of liberation. And it's presenting this process as a gradual process that brings one prisoner outside of the cave. And so it's a process that allows the soul to move away from appearances and to move toward reality and truth. The highest truth, of course, it's the sun, because the sun represents the idea of the good, which illuminates everything, illuminates every knowledge that we have. But the myth illustrates also something else, because yes, it tells us that philosophy, education, and culture are a process of liberation. They liberate us, but they require effort, they require courage, and they require the willingness to question authority and familiar beliefs. So they're also telling us, hey, yes, philosophy is a process of liberation. You know that. You also need to know how hard it is. How much fatigue does it require? Lastly, it brings to the fore another point. And this is the point according to which those who achieve knowledge have the ethical responsibility, have the moral responsibility of guiding others toward enlightenment. So liberating oneself is not enough. You also need to liberate others. You also need to come back to the cave and help others. That's the true meaning of education. That's the true meaning of achieving knowledge. Achieving knowledge just by oneself is not enough. But you can see that all of these truths, all of these ideas are presented through very vivid images that allow us to create a connection with the prisoner who liberates themselves. And so it allows us to create a bond, an emotional bond with the prisoner, so that we can immerse ourselves in what's going on and start to question our own life and what we do, in our own life. Okay, so this is everything I had to say. A very brief conclusion is I'm going to do a very brief conclusion right now, just to summarize what we have said. Plato recognized that human beings do not only think in abstract terms, but they also use images in order to understand complex and abstract ideas, but also in order to express what is at the limit of human understanding. There is all of the realm of the unknown. Abstract reasoning, of course, can be difficult, and so myths can help abstract ideas to be translated into memorable characters, vivid images, dramatic scenarios that render the invisible visible and the abstract meaningful. In other words, myth really provide, according to Plato, the scaffolding that can help us approach abstract truths on the one hand, but also it can provide the scaffolding that helps us to grasp the unknown, not just abstract ideas or complex ideas, but also the unknown or the irrational dimension of human existence. And thus, by practicing myths, by practicing telling and inventing myths, the reader, or just listening to myths, the reader can be better prepared to handle both abstraction and the unknown that belongs to human understanding. Now, by working in this way, Plato's myths sort of like anticipate what visual thinking does, because if we remember, visual thinking works with images in order to structure and guide our understanding of complex ideas, in order not to make complex ideas more comprehensible, more concrete, and at the same time to allow us to see these ideas from a different perspective. Visual thinking, however, externalizes ideas through sketches, images, and diagrams, while myths do the same inwardly. So they do not represent, they do not make sketches, of course, but they paint pictures in the mind's eye. They do that inwardly, while visual thinking does that outwardly. Okay. That's the main difference, and that's a difference that we're going to continue to see with Aristotle. And as you might expect now, since I told you, the next point is going to be Aristotle and the use of metaphors. So we covered the function, the role, the nature of myths within Plato's philosophy, and we saw how myths really resemble and anticipate some of the key aspects of visual thinking. Now we need to do the same in relation to metaphors and Aristotle, because Aristotle was the philosophers who first provided us with a clear, neat, and precise definition of metaphors, and also a classifications of all the various types of metaphors that can be produced by the human understanding, by the human mind. So, who was Aristotle? Let's start from the beginning. As much as Plato, Aristotle was one of the most influential thinkers in the history of philosophy. He was born in Stagira, which was in the north, Greece. So he was not from Athens, but he studied in Athens under the guidance of Plato. So he decided to be a student in the academy. And after a long period of training in philosophy, then he left the academy and decided to find his own philosophical school, the Lyceum or the Gymnasium. Aristotle was so famous, was able to become so famous in Greece that he actually got the job of becoming the teacher of Alexander the Great. Just to tell you how important at a certain time, how famous at a certain time Aristotle was in Greece during his life. But literally, Aristotle was a fleshy and walking encyclopedia, because his works covered every aspect, every field of knowledge, not just of philosophy as Plato did, but every field of knowledge, and that was like truly impressive. So he wrote about metaphysics, he wrote about ethics, he wrote about biology, he wrote about astronomy, he wrote about politics and rhetorics and art and poetics and so on and so forth. So you can see that he actually wrote about everything. For what concerns philosophy, there's a lot to say, of course, but we're just going to point one key aspect of Aristotle's philosophy. And that's the idea that knowledge starts from experience, from sensory perception. However, it must be said that even though even though knowledge starts with experience and sensory perception, its highest form is rational reflection. So for Aristotle, unlike Plato, according to which knowledge equals the possibility of grasping abstract ideas, and so it's a process of detaching ourselves from experience and from the illusions of the sensible world, as we saw with the allegory of the cave. For Aristotle, unlike Plato, then observation and logic must go hand in hand. They cannot be separated, so that understanding the world, or in order to understand the world, we need both experience and systematic reasoning. So that's the kind of basic idea that Aristotle had about knowledge and about our understanding of the world. But for what concerns ethics, on the other hand, Aristotle introduced the famous concept of the golden mean, through which he defined virtue. Virtue, indeed, is for Aristotle the middle point between two extremes or two excesses. And virtue is such a middle point because this middle point represents a point of moderation. And according to Aristotle, moderation is always a synonym of being a virtuous person, while following the excesses or the extremes is, on the contrary, a synonym of being unvirtuous, of being immoral in one's behaviors. Aristotle, however, as I told you, also talked about politics, and in politics, he explored the nature of the state and of citizenship, stressing the importance of creating a strong community and a practical governance. And lastly, in science, Aristotle was one of the earliest naturalists because he classified plants and animals. And indeed, he was the first one to have this very passion for classification, actually, and to put in words such a classification that we still use today. Of course, most of the theories that especially the scientific theories that Aristotle came up with, they were challenged by later scientists and later discoveries. But it is also true that Aristotle's methods, philosophical methods of inquiry, which combined empirical evidence with logic, remains fundamental even today. And if we think about it, it was a source of inspiration for the development of the modern scientific method. So you can see here that Aristotle really was one of the most profound and eclectic thinker who of the history of humanity, actually, not just the history of philosophy, because his influence was not limited to philosophy, but expanded throughout all fields of knowledge. Okay, yet, as I have mentioned to you, Aristotle was also interested in language, that is, in rhetoric and in poetry. And he wanted to understand how human beings think, how they speak, and how they understand the world. The topic of language is the topic that we needed to eviscerate, we needed to clarify right now, because that's the topic that involves metaphors and thus creates the most important connections with visual thinking, which is the sort of like broader topic of our 5 classes together. Okay, of course, Aristotle could have picked many different topics in relation to language, but he decided to pay his attention to metaphors. He decided to dedicate a lot of his attention to metaphors and the role that they have both in speech and thought. He, as I told you, was the first one who provided a clear definition and a classification of metaphors, explaining to us how important these metaphors are in everyday language and how they are a symbol of geniality. But we will see this later on. As Aristotle noticed, and we can agree with him, metaphors are very common in everyday language. For instance, we say time is money. And when we say time is money, we do not speak literally. We do not say that time equals money. But what we do is comparing two things that belongs to two different domains in order to show a similarity that there is between, in this case, time and money. And the similarity is based on the idea that both time and money are precious and we should not waste either money or time. You can see here that metaphors clearly are have a decorational and ornamental use because they make our speeches more interesting. But according to Aristotle, that's not the only function that metaphors have. Yes, they allow our speeches to be more beautiful, but the role that metaphors have is much more deep, is way deeper, because they allow us to they reveal something very important about how human beings create meanings and create similarities between different things in order then to create new meanings. They tell us something very important about how ideas can be expressed more vividly, and it also tells us they tell us something very important on how we can train our mind to see things from a different perspective and not only from the same perspective, so as to discover something new about that same thing. Okay, this is a very general introduction about what Aristotle thinks about metaphors. Before we go deeper into the analysis of what metaphors are, let me give you the context in which Aristotle talks about metaphors. And in order to give you the context, I need to say two words, literally two words. I'm going to be brief. I'll try about the rhetorics and the poetics, which are the two works in which Aristotle talks about metaphors. Okay, so generally speaking, both the poetics and the rhetorics talk about art, drama, poetry. They talk about speeches, and they talk about the art of persuasion and public speaking. However, okay, although in both works he tries to understand how people use language and how using language in an appropriate way helps us to understand the world, the two, the poetics and the rhetorics, look at metaphors from a different perspective. First of all, the rhetorics. In the rhetorics, what Aristotle does is basically to argue that the art of persuading does not only depend on logical arguments. Yes, logical arguments are fundamental to convince other people that we are telling the truth, that we are right, that our thesis is right. But at the same time, when we argue for a thesis, we have to make our speech beautiful, clear, and engaging. And according to Aristotle, metaphors are fundamental in order to make our speeches more beautiful, more enticing, more engaging, and clearer. And by doing so, metaphors can actually make our argument stronger. So metaphors are an ally in the art of persuasion. Metaphors are a very powerful partner and instrument that can be used to convince people more strongly. And that's the rhetorics. In the poetics, of course, Aristotle talks about poetry, about art, about drama, and he analyzes how poets and playwrights use words to bring different stories and characters to life. Here, metaphors, of course, play a central role because, especially in poetry, metaphors are truly fundamental, and we will see later on why. But here, Aristotle describes metaphors as I told you before, something that really helps our process of reasoning, as something that clarifies our complex and abstract ideas, and something that allows our mind to view things from a different perspective. So here, Aristotle underlines how metaphors are not simply a stylistic device, but they have a more profound meaning. Now, in the Poetics, Aristotle defines metaphor, and I quote, as giving a thing a name that belongs to something else. Now, this definition might seem very easy and straightforward to understand, but it actually says something profound, or it highlights a profound feature of both language and thought. Indeed, what it says is that a metaphor does not merely substitute one word for another, but it reshapes how we think and how we understand reality. By transferring a name, a metaphor forges a connection between two distinct domains, allowing us to understand one thing in terms of the other thing. Or it allows us to grasp something unfamiliar and abstract in terms of something more familiar and more concrete. That's the most fundamental use of metaphors. But to grasp this definition a little bit more concretely, let me make an example, of course. And I want to take another example, not the example of time is money, but the example of the human mind is a vessel. That's another metaphor that we can, that we usually make. Yes, that's a pretty common one, in which we take the vessel, which is a container for holding liquids, and we compare it and we connect it to the human mind. Now, if we analyze this metaphor, the first thing that we can say is that the mind, through this metaphor, is not it does not equal the vessel. So the metaphor does not say that the mind is like the vessel, is identical with a vessel, with a container. But what the metaphor says, what it allows us to do, is to conceptualize and visualize the mind as a container that can be fulfilled with knowledge, with ideas, with experience, and so on, as much as the vessel can be fulfilled, can be filled with liquids. If we go deeper and we continue to analyze this metaphor, we can also see how it conveys to us that the human mind both has a potential, but it also has limitations. Like a vessel, the human mind has a capacity to expand itself because it's like a container, sorry. So it can expand its knowledge, how many ideas it has, how many experiences it recounts or records, but it also has a limitation. And it's also important to feel this mind properly, because otherwise it cannot serve its purpose effectively. So you see here that through the image of a vessel, we can understand something new about how our human mind works and how it functions on a daily basis. Metaphors like this one are very powerful because they engage both reason and imagination as much as myth did. And they allow us certainly to make abstract and complex idea more concrete, as we have already said multiple times, and thus visualize these abstract ideas in a more vivid way. But they also encourage our reflection, because by comparing the mind to a vessel, they prompt our reflection. They prompt us to ask questions, and you remember how questions are fundamental. Indeed, they stimulate questions like, for instance, what do we pour into our mind, like we pour liquids in the vessel? What does the mind contain? What can it contain? How many information can it contain? And how does the mind work to make us understand the reality that we experience? You see here that really metaphors are a tool for viewing things from a different perspective, but at the same time from making questions in order to better grasp the reality of, in this case, the mind of the thing that we want to understand. Okay. Without metaphors, probably much of our human thought would remain obscure, because much of it would be trapped in abstraction, and it would not be able to translate and express certain ideas with images and with imagination, which is a faculty that is fundamental to understand our experience. Indeed, it is thanks to metaphors that we can grasp love as a journey, time as a resource, and knowledge as a light. And thus, it is through metaphors that we can transform certain ideas into images that we can picture, that we can feel, emotionally feel, and that we can discuss. So you can really see how much metaphors not only enrich our language, making it more beautiful and elegant and sophisticated, but they also expand the reach of our thoughts, of our ability to think. And of course, they do so by making the invisible visible and the abstract meaningful. Okay, that's Aristotle's definition of metaphors in the Poetics. Now we want to look at the classifications that he does, because yes, he tells us that metaphors work by transferring a meaning from one thing to the other, thus allowing to understand one concept in terms of the other. But what are the types of metaphors that we use on a daily basis? Aristotle talks about 4 different kinds of metaphors. The first one is the metaphors that goes from genus to species. And this is a metaphor then that operates by going from the broad category to something more specific, to a specific thing. Now, the idea here is that the metaphor should help us illuminate a particular instance by situating them within its larger conceptual context or framework. Let me make an example to clarify what I just said. When we, for instance, say, I don't know, Clara did an heroic deed because she defended her friend who was harassed verbally by another person. And we say, Clara, defending your friend was an heroic deed. That's a metaphor. It is a metaphor from Genius to Species because we are taking the broad idea of heroism and we apply it to a particular action, which in this case is the action of defending a friend verbally who was harassed by another person. And in this way, we can help people understand the act, the specific act, in terms of the larger quality that exemplifies it. So I help someone understand the act of defending a friend through the quality of heroism, because that particular act belongs to heroism. The second metaphor is the opposite one, because instead of going from genus to species, it goes from species to genus. And so it works in the opposite direction. I'm using a specific example to describe something more abstract and more general. In this case, what I want to illuminate is the general quality of a thing by using an example, by showing how it works in action. That's the point. That's a fundamental point. Again, an example to make it clear. There is a very smart person in the class, a very brilliant student, and we can say, or the teacher can say, oh, you're the Archimedes of our class. That's a metaphor. And in this metaphor, we can see how the person, the student, is compared to Archimedes. Why? Because this metaphor takes the concrete example of Archimedes to represent the idea of geniality, the idea of being a genius. So that particular person is being called the Archimedes of our class because he's like a genius. And Archimedes was indeed a genius, or were considered a genius. So you see that we are illuminating the general quality of being a genius, a general idea, through a specific example. Third type of metaphor, from species to species. In this case, we compare two specific things by highlighting the similarities that exist between them. In this case, what we want to do is to emphasize all of the relationships and all of the qualities that these two things have, and that might be otherwise overlooked because we do not compare them. And here's another example. The heart is a lion in courage. We can also take the example of the mind is a vessel, or time is money. But let's make another example to have a broader understanding. The heart is a lion in courage. Here we have two very specific things that are being compared. The heart, which is part of a concrete organ of the human body, and a lion, which is a particular animal. Here we're emphasizing bravery as being a property that is common both to the heart and to the lion. And we're bringing to the fore how the heart is brave by comparing it to the lion, which is the most brave, or the bravest, animal in the world. Last but not least, the last type of metaphor, which is the metaphor by analogy. This is the richest and most enticing metaphor according to Aristotle, because it is the richest for philosophy. It's the most important for a philosophical type of inquiry. In this case, we are comparing two pair of things, two set of things that belong to different domains, and we're doing so in order to see how their relationships mirror one another. Let me, of course, make an example because it might be hard to understand. If we say an old age is to life, so the evening is to the day, we are creating a parallel between two distinct domains. One, the stages of human life, two, the progression of the day. And we are saying that being old is the same as the evening because they both come either at the end of life or at the end of the day. You see here that we have two set of things and we are making them, we're comparing them, we are bringing them together in order to create a parallel and to bring to the fore the similarities that exist between the two. Okay, that's the classification that Aristotle made about metaphors in the Poetics. Before I conclude, I want to just say one little thing that I think is interesting and important, because Aristotle adds, always in the Poetics, that the ability to use metaphors is a sign of genius, is a sign of geniality, as he claims, and I quote, "The greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor, because it is a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars." You can see here that creating good metaphors it requires a special kind of perception, which is called by Aristotle intuitive perception. And this kind of perception is the ability to discern similarities between things that appear as completely different, as having nothing to do with one another. This ability to see similarities between things that are different, that belongs to different domains, is not a trivial skill. It's actually a sign of sharpness. It's a sign of creativity. It's a sign of intellectual agility. So there are many faculties that are implied in the creation of metaphors, and that's why they are a sign of being a genius. Of course, poets are the ones who most of all create metaphors because they have to create they have to use a beautiful and enticing language that spark emotions into the readers. And so poetry really, really relies on language and on metaphors in order to convey all of the emotions and ideas and concepts that it wants to convey. And so poets usually are the ones who can better express metaphors and can better come up with similarities between different things. Yet, Aristotle also wants to warn us not to use too many metaphors, because yes, it's true that metaphors are helpful. They make our argument stronger. They also are a sign of geniality, of being a genius. But we should not create an overabundance of metaphors, because otherwise they risk obtaining the opposite results. So instead of making what we're saying more clear, they are obscuring the meaning of what we're saying. So the point is always to find a balance, to find a proportionality between arguments, logical arguments, and metaphors, between the beauty of the speech that we are trying to achieve and the clarity that the speech has to have. Okay, so we have come to the final part, the conclusion, the real conclusion of this class. I want to say as a summary that Aristotle's conception of metaphor show us how important figurative language is for our human thought, and thus how much images are important for our thought. Metaphors, like myths for Plato, are not just a fancy way of speaking. They're not an ornament to our speeches, but they are a central tool for learning, for persuasion, and for creativity, thus poetry. And we should always try to come up with metaphors in order to better explain how we feel, what we think, and the ideas that we think are important. But Aristotle recognized more than 2,000 years ago something that remains true even today, that metaphors are a window into how the human mind works, and it works by creating similarities. Visual thinking and metaphors thus have something in common, because visual thinking sort of like reappropriates this fundamental truth that Aristotle recognized more than 2,000 years ago. And thus the idea that images are a window into the understanding of how our mind works, and metaphors or images can always help us reason, can always help us to better the process of our thinking, can help the mind to reason better, and to produce and to clarify better the ideas that we have. Sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit, but there are some differences, of course, and the differences are the same as for myth, because as we said before, well, images translate some complex ideas into something external. So they externalize the ideas that they have, and by externalizing them into sketches, diagrams, and images, they make them more concrete. On the other hand, metaphors, they remain within the mind. So they create pictures within our own mind. And you see that's an important difference. That's a fundamental difference. For instance, let me show you this sort of like this difference that exists. When we say time is money, we are creating a picture, and we are comparing time with money. We're associating the two pictures. But in order to understand that time is money, we can also represent time in a chart, in a pie chart, and we can divide the time into all the things that we want to do. This visual representation makes us understand the idea that time is very valuable. It's a resource, and we need to control time. We need to manage the time that we have in the appropriate way. We should not waste it. But you see here that while metaphors work with language, and thus they create pictures within our mind, what visual thinking does is to represent externally through images, diagrams, sketches, and so on and so forth, this idea that time is valuable. And so instead of working with language, it works with images. It works with draws, with sketches. And that's the fundamental difference. But it's also true that we can combine them, and we can try to combine metaphors with visual and external images in order to expand our own knowledge and our understanding. So I said everything that I have prepared at home about metaphors and myths, about this idea of thinking with images. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you liked all of these informations about these ideas of how we think visually and not only abstractly through language. And we'll see us next week with a new class on this idea and the implications between philosophy and visual thinking. Thank you.